The room is quiet, and the night has settled in. The only sound is the soft rustle of blankets or the faint hum of distant wind against old stone walls. Welcome to Sleeping History, a place where the past unfolds slowly, gently, and without rush. Tonight, we'll step inside the kitchens of medieval Europe, where warmth, hunger, and humble routines shaped every day. We'll explore what people ate, how it was made, and how those meals brought rhythm and comfort to their lives. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it for you right now? It's always fascinating to imagine how far apart we may be in place and hour, yet somehow we're sharing this quiet experience together. One calm story, told slowly across time and space. Now close your eyes and picture a small stone cottage nestled at the edge of a medieval village. Its roof is thatched with straw, darkened by years of wind and rain, and its tiny windows are covered with thin sheets of oiled parchment that soften the light coming through. It's early morning, and the world is still wrapped in mist. The ground outside is damp. The air smells of earth and wood smoke, and a distant rooster calls out into the quiet. Inside, the kitchen is waking. There is no rush, no loud clatter or morning bustle, just the slow, practiced rhythm of a single woman moving about her hearth. She kneels to coax life back into the fire from yesterday's embers, adding bits of dried moss and kindling with careful hands. A few gentle breaths and the flicker returns, soft and orange, dancing in the center of the room. Hanging above the fire is a blackened iron pot, and inside it, a thin barley porridge bubbles faintly. The woman stirs it with a wooden spoon, whose handle has been worn smooth from years of use. She adds chopped onion, gathered from the storage pit behind the house, and a pinch of dried herbs from a string above the mantel. The scent rises slowly, earthy, familiar, comforting. This is breakfast for a medieval peasant family. There is no sugar, no coffee, no plates or silver spoons, just porridge, maybe a heel of bread from yesterday, and a warm place near the fire. As the sun begins to rise beyond the low hills, its pale light filters through the parchment windows and bathes the room in a soft, golden haze. A young boy stirs from his straw mattress in the corner and pulls a blanket over his head. He'll rise when the food is ready. In the corner, a clay jug of water sits on a low wooden table beside a round loaf of coarse bread. The bread was baked 3 days ago, and it's grown firm, but it will soften once dipped in the porridge. Beside the jug, a small crock of salt sits with a cloth draped loosely over the top. Salt was precious, and often used sparingly. But today is an ordinary day. No feast, no festival, so just a pinch will do. A few chickens wander past the open doorway outside, pecking at damp soil and clucking softly. Smoke curls lazily from the chimney above, blending with the morning mist. In the distance, a church bell rings out across the fields. A slow, low chime that marks the beginning of another day in the village. Back inside, the family begins to gather near the hearth. A man sits on a low stool, boots beside him, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He smells the porridge and smiles. The girl, still wrapped in her blanket, sits cross-legged on the floor, warming her hands by the fire. No one speaks loudly. There's no need to. As the woman ladles warm porridge into simple wooden bowls, the day begins as it always does, with a meal made from what is available, prepared slowly and shared quietly. This is where our story begins, in a place where food was never wasted, where every bite was earned, and where kitchens were not just rooms, but the very heart of life. And now, with the fire crackling gently behind us and the scent of barley lingering in the air, let us continue deeper into the world of medieval food, where each dish tells a story and each kitchen holds a memory. The sky outside still holds a touch of night, deep blue and cool, as the first birds begin their gentle morning songs. In the countryside, far from the stone towers and clamour of towns, kitchens stir before the sun fully rises. Whether in a small peasant hut or a castle with many halls, the kitchen was always the first part of the home to awaken. Let's begin with the peasant home. Simple, practical, and built with hands that knew the land. The kitchen was not a separate room, but a corner of a larger shared space. It might be little more than a hearth dug into the earth, surrounded by flat stones and scattered with ash. A heavy pot hung from a hook above the flames or rested directly on glowing coals. There were no ovens, no chimneys in most cases. The smoke drifted upward, filling the rafters, blackening the beams, and slowly escaping through thatched gaps. A bundle of firewood leaned nearby, tied with twine. It had been gathered the day before. Small sticks, dried leaves, and maybe a log or two, if the family was lucky. The wood was precious, especially in colder months when fires had to be maintained day and night. Starting from cold was time-consuming, and every ember from the night before was saved with care, cradled in ash to preserve the heat. As the fire is kindled anew, it doesn't roar, it sighs. A whisper of flame curls around the wood, slowly gaining strength, filling the air with warmth and a familiar scent. A small iron tripod stands nearby, its legs uneven from years of use. The cook, usually the woman of the house, moves through the routine without thought. She knows each motion. Her hands find what they need by feel. This is her rhythm. She checks a cloth-wrapped bundle tucked in the corner, carrots and parsnips from the last harvest, a wedge of onion, and perhaps a few sprigs of parsley. These will flavour the pottage, a kind of vegetable stew that could simmer all day and be eaten morning, noon, or night. Its ingredients changed with the seasons and the household's luck. Some days there was a little meat, other days just barley and greens. But it always began the same way, with water in the pot, vegetables chopped by hand, and salt added carefully. In the noble households, far grander kitchens lay below ground level or off to the side of great halls. There, stone walls trapped the heat of dozens of fires, and the smells of roasting meat, baking bread, and boiling sauces mingled in the air like perfume. But even in these vast kitchens, the day began quietly. Apprentice cooks swept the floors with straw brooms, careful to remove ash and crumbs. Bakers checked the temperature of clay ovens by placing their hands near the mouth of the fire and counting the seconds. If it was too hot for more than a few breaths, it needed to cool. Too cold, and the bread would never rise. A master cook, wearing a stained apron and carrying a list from the steward, directed preparations for the morning meal. There might be pheasant or pork to be thawed, fish to be gutted, eggs to be fetched from the dovecote. Servants moved in hushed tones, focused not on conversation, but on motion, slicing, fetching, stirring, measuring. The castle would wake soon, and when it did, everything must be ready. The kitchen in any home, rich or poor, was both anchor and engine. It grounded the family with its warmth, and it powered the day with its meals. In a time before alarms and electric lights, the rising fire was the signal to begin. And once the pot bubbled and the bread was torn, the morning truly arrived. In this soft, steady rhythm of flame, of breath, of spoon against pot, the medieval kitchen greeted each dawn not with noise, but with care. The first meal of the day in medieval Europe was not one of indulgence. There were no eggs with golden yolks on buttery toast, no sizzling sausages, no hot mugs of coffee. Instead, for the vast majority of people, especially peasants, breakfast was a humble, practical affair. It was not meant to be enjoyed as a ritual, but to prepare the body for the long labour ahead. In a rural cottage, as the fire crackles low and steady, the day's first meal is already underway. A wooden ladle dips into a pot of thick barley porridge, the steam rising in slow, lazy curls. This porridge, often called pottage when cooked longer with vegetables, is made from grains stored in a cool corner of the house: barley, rye, or oats, depending on the region and season. The grains are soaked overnight, softening just enough to cook quickly in the morning light. There might be a dash of milk if the household kept a cow or goat. But in winter, even milk could be scarce. Instead, water did the job. The flavour was mild, the texture lumpy and warm, and for a family that worked the land, it was enough. The porridge would fill their stomachs and give them strength for hours in the fields. A small round of bread, heavy, dark, and coarse, often accompanied the meal. This bread was not the fluffy white loaf found in noble halls. It was made from a mixture of grains, ground roughly, and baked in communal ovens or on flat stones. Called maslin bread, it used whatever flours were available, usually barley and rye. Wheat was rare and costly, reserved for the wealthier classes. Children would eat from the same bowl as their siblings, scooping with wooden spoons or tearing bread to dip into the porridge. There were no individual plates or utensils for most families. The concept of personal servings was foreign in a world where food was shared and never wasted. If the family kept hens, there might be a small egg or two to boil. But even this was a luxury, saved for feast days or sick children. Honey, when available, was a prized sweetener, but far too valuable for daily meals. Instead, wild herbs or leeks from the garden might be stirred into the pot to add variety. Some households drank small beer with breakfast, a weak, lightly fermented ale with barely any alcohol. It was safer than most water, and even children consumed it. The beer was cloudy, slightly sour, and stored in clay jugs by the fire to keep it from freezing on cold mornings. In some parts of Europe, cheese made from goat or sheep's milk found its way into breakfast, a firm, salty wedge shaved thin and shared between many. In others, bits of smoked lard or pork fat might be melted into the porridge for added richness, but only when times were good. Breakfast was rarely eaten in silence, but neither was it boisterous. It was a moment of preparation, taken without rush, before the demands of the day arrived. The father would lace his boots, the mother would wrap her shawl, the children, still half asleep, would chew slowly by the hearth, watching the flames dance in the morning dim. If a neighbour stopped by early, a piece of bread might be offered, torn from the loaf and handed without ceremony. Hospitality was not formal, it was instinctive. To share was to survive. By the time the bowl was empty and the last crumbs brushed into the fire, the air outside had warmed just slightly, and the village began to stir. The blacksmith lit his forge. The shepherd opened the gate to the pasture. The day had begun, and it began always with something hot, simple, and made by hand. In this meal, plain as it was, lay the rhythm of medieval life, routine, necessity, and quiet care. Of all the foods that passed through medieval kitchens, none held a place more central than bread. It was not simply a meal, it was the meal. Rich or poor, young or old, bread sustained every household and shaped every table. It came in many forms: textures and colours, and it revealed much about a person's status, region, and the season in which they lived. In peasant homes, bread was dense and dark, made from a blend of grains like rye, barley, and oats. These grains were more resilient than wheat and easier to grow in poorer soils. The result was a loaf that was hearty and filling, though not soft by modern standards. It had a cracked, thick crust, a chewy centre, and a taste that was slightly sour, sometimes even bitter, depending on how the dough was fermented. This type of bread, often called maslin, was rarely sliced. Instead, it was torn by hand or broken apart at the table. A single large loaf might be shared by a family over several days, becoming stiffer and more difficult to chew with each passing morning. But nothing went to waste. Even hardened pieces could be softened in broth or porridge. Some were crumbled into stews or soups. The crusts were sometimes rubbed with garlic or dipped in a bit of vinegar for added flavour. For the poorest, bread was made from whatever was available. Sometimes even ground peas or beans were mixed into the flour to stretch it further. In times of scarcity, acorns or bark flour were added, though these made the bread coarse and difficult to digest. Still, bread meant survival, and even the roughest loaf was better than none. In wealthier homes, especially among the nobility and in monasteries, bread looked very different. White bread, known as manchet, was made from finely sifted wheat flour. It required multiple steps of refinement and skilled labour, which made it expensive. This bread was soft, light, and prized for its texture. It was often baked in round or oval loaves, served warm when possible, and accompanied by butter, cheese, or even fruit preserves. Some households had their own ovens, but most villages shared a communal bakehouse. Families would prepare their dough at home, then carry it to the oven wrapped in cloth or placed in wooden trays. The baker would recognise each loaf by its shape, or the markings made with a knife. A fee was paid for the use of the oven, usually in kind, a small piece of dough, a slice of finished bread, or a service owed in return. Baking was more than sustenance. It was tradition. Recipes, if they could be called that, were passed down by hand. Measurements were made by feel. A handful of flour, a pinch of salt, a splash of water, kneaded with care and left to rise in warm corners near the hearth. The dough was covered with cloth, sometimes sprinkled with ashes to keep flies away, and left to prove slowly over hours. The smell of baking bread was familiar and grounding. In the castle kitchens, it filled long corridors with warmth, drawing servants and dogs alike. In villages, it drifted through open windows and mingled with the smoke of morning fires. Children knew when to listen for the bell that signalled the oven's opening. Housewives waited with baskets, ready to collect their family's share. There were feast breads too, braided, spiced, or glazed with honey. But those were rare, reserved for saints' days or weddings. On most days, bread was bread, dependable, nourishing, and present at every meal. It lined bowls, soaked up sauces, and became a tool when cutlery was scarce. Even the poorest homes might use stale bread as a trencher, a plate of sorts, which absorbed juices and was then eaten or tossed to animals. And when meals were over, leftover crumbs were swept carefully into a cloth, saved for the next day or offered to birds and pigs. Nothing was wasted. In a world where food was hard won, bread was sacred, not in ceremony, but in daily life. It was more than food. It was a promise that, for one more day, there was something to eat. Before the smell of bread filled the kitchen or porridge simmered on the hearth, the journey of a meal began in the fields. Grain was the backbone of medieval diets, but it didn't come ready to use. It had to be harvested, dried, threshed, winnowed, ground, and stored. Each step part of a slow, careful process rooted in the rhythm of the seasons and the strength of human hands. In the wide open fields that surrounded most medieval villages, grain crops like barley, rye, oats, and wheat swayed gently in the summer wind. Come harvest time, families worked together, cutting stalks with sickles and gathering them into bundles called sheaves. These were tied and stacked into stooks to dry in the sun. The harvest was an all-consuming task, urgent, exhausting, and communal. Fields were emptied with care, as one failed harvest could mean hunger until spring. Once dry, the grain was threshed. This meant beating the sheaves to separate the edible kernels from the straw. Peasants did this by hand, using flails, a pair of wooden sticks connected by leather. They swung the flails over a hard floor, often in barns, sending bits of grain flying loose. It was dusty, repetitive work, and every kernel mattered. Next came winnowing. This involved tossing the mixture of grain and chaff into the air with wide, flat baskets. The wind would carry the lighter husks away, while the heavier grain fell back into the basket. It required a steady hand, the right breeze, and patience. In some regions, this was done indoors by shaking sieves or cloths, but the principle remained the same. The grain had to be cleaned. Only then was it ready for grinding. And this is where medieval ingenuity met daily necessity. In most villages, grain was taken to a local mill. These mills were powered either by water or wind, depending on the geography. Watermills, built beside rivers or streams, used wooden wheels to turn heavy stones. Windmills, found more commonly in flat, open landscapes, captured the breeze with large sails. In both types, the power turned a massive millstone that ground the grain into flour or meal. The sound of the grinding stones, a low, steady rumble, was familiar and constant near any mill. Inside, dust filled the air and coated the miller's clothing in white. Millers were often viewed with both respect and suspicion. Their work was essential, but they controlled the flow of flour, and their fees were closely watched. They were allowed to keep a portion of each sack as payment, but many believed they took more than their fair share. For families without access to a mill, grain could be ground at home using hand mills, also called querns. These were simple tools, 2 flat stones with one placed atop the other. The top stone was turned by hand using a wooden handle, and the grain fed through a hole in the center. It was slow, hard work, especially for women, who often spent hours each week grinding enough to make bread or porridge. Once ground, the flour or meal was stored carefully. In the corner of the kitchen, a wooden bin or clay jar might hold the family's supply, covered with cloth or a fitted lid to keep it dry. Rats, mice, and insects were constant threats, so grain and flour were never left open. Some homes hung sacks from the ceiling beams to keep them out of reach. In manors and monasteries, dedicated storerooms with thick walls and cool air were used, lined with barrels and bags stacked neatly in rows. Grain was never taken for granted. It was counted, measured, and rationed. A family might have just enough for the winter, and any spoilage could bring hunger. Dried herbs were sometimes placed among the sacks to repel pests. Stones were removed carefully by hand. The entire household knew how much grain remained. It was a constant awareness. And yet, with all this effort, it was worth it. Because with each kernel ground came the promise of bread, of warmth, of a table with something to offer. In a world built on labor and patience, the humble grain stood at the center. silent, small, and quietly powerful. If bread was the backbone of the medieval diet, then pottage was its warm, beating heart. It was the one dish that crossed all boundaries, from peasant to noble, from monastery to manor, filling bellies in every season. Thick, steaming, and endlessly adaptable, pottage was more than a meal. It was a method, a tradition, and for many, a daily necessity. At its simplest, pottage was a mixture of water, grains, and whatever vegetables were available, all simmered together into a thick, nourishing stew. The beauty of pottage lay in its flexibility. No two pots were ever quite the same. A handful of barley here, a chopped leek there. Some days a carrot, others a turnip, a pinch of herbs from the garden, or a spoonful of sour milk stirred in just before serving. It changed with the seasons, the region, and the household's fortunes. In the morning, the fire was kindled, and the pot was set to hang or rest on the coals. This was no quick meal. It was meant to cook for hours, absorbing flavour and thickening with time. In some homes, the pottage pot rarely left the hearth at all. It was simply topped off with water and new ingredients as needed. The stew evolved day by day, a living dish shared by everyone in the household. The base often started with grains, barley, oats or spelt, soaked overnight and simmered until soft. These gave the pottage body, turning water into a filling, porridge-like mixture. Vegetables came next, usually chopped roughly by hand and added one at a time. Onions were nearly always included, lending their savoury flavour to the entire pot. Leeks, garlic, and herbs like parsley or thyme made appearances when available. For the poorest, this might be all. A vegetarian dish out of necessity, not choice. But even without meat, it was hearty and sustaining. When possible, scraps of salted pork or cured bacon were added for richness. These weren't large cuts, perhaps just a bone or a fatty rind left over from last week's feast. Meat was expensive and often reserved for Sundays or special days. Yet even a little could transform the flavour of the pottage, lending its savour to every bite. In wealthier kitchens, pottage could be much more elaborate. Nobles might dine on mortrews, a thick meat pottage made from ground pork or poultry mixed with breadcrumbs and eggs, seasoned with expensive spices like saffron or ginger. These were served in courses, ladled into ceramic bowls, and eaten with carved spoons. Sweet pottages also existed, made with almonds, rice, raisins, and honey, especially in courts that had access to imported goods. Yet the essence remained the same. A single pot, simmering gently, feeding many. In monastic communities, where meals were taken in silence, pottage was a common staple. Cooked in great iron kettles, stirred with wooden paddles, and served to long rows of monks, it offered warmth and sustenance without indulgence. Sometimes fish was added, eels from local streams or salted cod from the coast, to comply with religious fasting days. The texture of pottage varied. Some liked it thin and brothy, eaten with bread for dipping. Others preferred it thick and porridge-like, eaten by the spoonful with nothing else. A good pottage was not flashy. It was familiar, comforting, and dependable. It filled the stomach and soothed the spirit. Children grew up with its taste, elders relied on its nourishment, and travellers looked forward to its warmth. It was cooked with care, seasoned with hope, and eaten with quiet gratitude. As the fire crackled beneath the pot and the steam rose in soft spirals, it wasn't just food that simmered. It was a part of life itself, a meal made slowly, shared simply, and remembered fondly. In the medieval kitchen, vegetables were the quiet companions of daily life, never the centerpiece of grand feasts, but always present, filling pots and plates with their humble flavors. They grew in gardens, along village paths, and in monastery courtyards, providing nourishment not through extravagance, but through consistency and care. Peasant families, in particular, relied heavily on vegetables for their daily meals. Most did not own livestock beyond a few chickens or a single pig. Meat was rare. Instead, meals were built from the soil, from whatever could be grown, foraged, or preserved. These vegetables, though simple, played a central role in survival. Take the leek, for example. Hardy, flavorful, and resistant to cold, leeks were a favorite in stews and pottages. Their gentle onion-like flavor added depth to even the plainest dish. Grown in narrow beds and harvested well into the colder months, leeks were easy to clean, easy to store, and endlessly versatile. Onions, too, were essential. They grew in nearly every garden and were used not just for flavor, but for preservation. Sliced thin and dried, or hung in braids from the rafters, they lasted for months. A chopped onion could form the foundation of a stew, be rubbed on stale bread for a faint sharpness, or added to a pan with butter or lard for a richer meal. Cabbage was another staple. Though its scent, when boiled, was less than inviting, it was filling, grew well in most climates, and could be planted multiple times a year. It often appeared in pottage alongside other root vegetables and was sometimes pickled for long-term storage. The leaves could also be used to wrap food or cover bowls. Carrots, in their original form, were not the orange taproots we know today. Medieval carrots were often purple, yellow, or white, with a stronger, earthier flavor. They were boiled, mashed, or roasted near the fire. In wealthier homes, they might be cooked with spices or sweetened with honey. Parsnips and turnips were also common, especially in northern climates. These root vegetables were hearty and stored well in cool cellars. Sweet and starchy when cooked, they were often used in place of grains when supplies were low. Turnips could be grated into stews or served boiled with a bit of salt. Garlic grew wild in many areas and was used for both culinary and medicinal purposes. Though pungent, it was prized for its ability to transform bland ingredients into something savory. A clove of garlic mashed into a pottage could lift the whole dish. Beans and peas were often dried and kept through winter. These legumes were soaked and cooked slowly, added to stews or mashed with herbs. They were filling, inexpensive, and grown in large quantities. In some monasteries, entire fields were dedicated to beans, which provided protein during fasting seasons when meat was forbidden. Herbs were gathered from kitchen gardens or nearby fields. Parsley, thyme, sage, and dill were favorites. While spices were expensive and imported, these local herbs added flavor without cost. They were used fresh in summer and dried in bundles for the colder months. Even a handful of chopped herbs could make a bowl of boiled greens feel thoughtful and complete. The rhythm of the medieval vegetable garden followed the seasons. Spring brought young greens and leeks. Summer offered beans and herbs. Autumn yielded roots, onions, and the last cabbages. Winter relied on what was stored: dried peas, wrinkled carrots, and a few hardy sprouts from a cellar bin. In castles and manors, vegetable use was more refined, but not drastically different. Cooks used many of the same plants, though in greater variety and quantity. Some noble gardens experimented with foreign plants, spinach from the east, for example, or artichokes in warmer regions. But still, the basics remained: onions, leeks, and leafy greens. In the medieval world, vegetables were not glamorous, but they were dependable. They grew in poor soil, in narrow beds, in window boxes and monastery rows. They filled the gaps left by meatless days and stretched meals when grain ran low. They were eaten by everyone, every day, and in their quiet way, they kept people alive. Long before grocery stores or pantry shelves, medieval people looked to the forests, fields, and hedgerows for their ingredients. Foraging was not a quaint pastime. It was a vital part of survival. What couldn't be grown in the garden or bought at market was gathered from the land itself, carefully, quietly, and with practiced eyes. In spring, the ground awakened with edible greens. Young nettles, though stingy to the touch, were prized for their iron-rich leaves and earthy flavour. A quick blanching over the fire softened them into something tender and nourishing. Mixed into pottage or boiled with barley, they added colour and nutrition to otherwise bland meals. Wild garlic grew in shady patches beneath trees, its flat, broad leaves and white flowers easy to spot for those who knew where to look. Crushed between fingers, it released its unmistakable scent. It could be added to soups or stews, or used fresh in a kind of paste with salt and oil, when such luxuries were available. Sorrel and dandelion leaves too were common greens. Their tartness helped cut the heaviness of meat and grain, and they were among the first things to appear after a long winter. They were often gathered by children, sent out with woven baskets, and a list of plants to look for, and just as importantly, those to avoid. Mushrooms offered variety but required deep knowledge. Only certain types were safe to eat, and families passed this knowledge down through generations. Some were cooked into stews, while others were dried on strings and hung near the hearth. The drying process preserved their flavour for months, allowing for richer meals in the cold seasons. Still, caution was constant. Mistaking one mushroom for another could be fatal. In summer, berries filled the hedgerows, blackberries, raspberries, elderberries, and gooseberries. These were eaten fresh when ripe or mashed into porridges and mixed with honey if the household kept bees. Some were boiled into thick preserves, though sugar was rare and expensive. Others were dried in the sun or baked into simple flatbreads and cakes in noble kitchens. Nuts were another important find. Hazelnuts and walnuts, when gathered in late summer or autumn, could be stored through winter. Crushed and added to gruel, they provided a welcome richness and crunch. In monasteries, ground nuts were sometimes used to thicken sauces or enrich dishes during fasting periods, when animal products were avoided. From the trees came fruits like crab apples and wild plums. Tart and small, they weren't eaten raw as much as boiled into sauces or fermented into ciders. In noble estates, orchards might produce apples and pears of better quality, but for many, the small wild varieties were good enough. They were sliced and dried for winter or cooked into evening meals as a soft, sweet treat. Herbs grew almost anywhere and were gathered when fresh, then dried in bunches that hung from rafters. Sage, mint, thyme, marjoram, and wild fennel were all valued. Even a pinch added to the pot could lift a dish and make it feel special. Some herbs, like yarrow or chamomile, were used as much for healing as for cooking, steeped into teas or crushed into salves. In many regions, seaweed was gathered along coastal rocks and dried for use in broths. Inland, rose hips were plucked in autumn and made into simple syrups or steeped in warm water. These bright red fruits were packed with nutrients and offered a rare hint of sweetness. The act of foraging was more than a task. It was a way of staying close to the land. Villagers knew which plants appeared first, which mushrooms grew in which groves, and when the nuts were ready to fall. Foraging was often done at dawn or just before dusk, in silence, listening for birdsong and rustling leaves. It was slow and patient work, but rewarding. For the medieval cook, these wild ingredients were not merely extras, they were the key to variety in a limited world. A bowl of barley could taste entirely different, depending on the handful of herbs or greens tossed in. A stew could become something new with a few berries or a crushed nut. And in the quiet corners of the forest, where moss grew thick and the light filtered through old branches, the day's meal might be waiting, hidden, but ready to be found. In the heart of every medieval home, the hearth was more than a place to cook. It was the centre of warmth, gathering, and life. Kitchens of the time, whether in humble cottages or great manor houses, revolved around fire. Without it, there was no heat, no food, and no comfort. And with fire came tools, simple, sturdy, and worn from daily use. Let us begin in a peasant's kitchen, where the fireplace wasn't always a formal structure. In many cottages, especially in earlier centuries, the fire was built directly on a packed earth floor, surrounded by flat stones. Over time, some homes added a shallow hearth made of brick or clay, but even these were modest, without chimneys. Smoke rose freely, curling upward to blacken the ceiling beams and escape through holes in the thatched roof. The scent of wood smoke lingered in every piece of fabric, every wooden bowl. Above the fire, an iron hook or chain hung from a beam. This was used to suspend cooking pots, heavy, blackened cauldrons made of cast iron or clay. These pots had rounded bottoms, ideal for sitting over hot coals or swinging gently above the flames. Meals were rarely roasted. They were boiled, stewed, or simmered slowly throughout the day. Long-handled spoons carved from wood stirred the contents of these pots. They were often passed down between generations, their surfaces darkened from hours spent over fire. A ladle, carved deeper, would be used to serve porridge or pottage into bowls. Knives too were common. Small utilitarian blades used for chopping vegetables, trimming meat, or spreading soft cheese. Most adults owned a knife and carried it on their belt, using the same blade for meals and work alike. Bowls and cups were carved from wood or shaped from clay. The wooden ones were sanded smooth and oiled for durability. Clay vessels, made by local potters, were baked in communal kilns and glazed in earthy browns and reds. These items chipped easily, but were valued and repaired when possible. For plates, trenchers were used, thick slices of stale bread that soaked up juices and could be eaten or discarded after the meal. Forks were almost unknown to the average household. Eating was done with fingers, knives, or spoons. Even in noble houses, forks only began appearing toward the late Middle Ages, and often more as curiosities than common tools. Hands, clean or wiped on cloths, did most of the work. In better-off homes and castles, the fireplace became a grander affair, wide, stone-built, and set into the wall. Chimneys directed the smoke upward, and iron racks were installed to hold pots and kettles at different heights. Roasting spits were used here, rotated slowly by hand, or with the help of a servant, sometimes even a specially trained spit boy. These children spent hours turning a handle near the flames, ensuring meat cooked evenly. Large iron griddles, or girdles, were set directly over embers to bake flatbreads or pancakes. Dutch ovens, deep pots with lids, were buried in ash to slowly cook stews or beans. Tongs, pokers, and bellows lined the hearth edge, their metal tips hot and worn. Some castles had multiple fireplaces, each serving a different purpose. One for meat, one for baking, another for brewing or boiling water. Baking bread, however, often required a separate oven. In peasant villages, this meant using a communal bakehouse, a domed clay or stone oven heated by firewood. Once the oven reached the proper temperature, the ashes were swept out and loaves were slid in using long-handled wooden paddles. In wealthier homes, brick ovens were built into the walls, but even these had to be heated by fire, then cleaned, then sealed for baking. Fire management was an essential skill. Too much heat and the food would scorch. Too little and nothing would cook. The ability to judge flame by sight, smell, and touch was passed down from mother to daughter, servant to apprentice. It wasn't written, it was lived. Even the layout of the kitchen reflected this. Tools hung on walls or leaned in corners, within reach, but out of harm's way. Herbs dried near the warmth. Water jugs were kept away from the flames. Every item had its place. There was no clutter, only what was needed. And so, as the fire glowed and shadows flickered on the walls, these tools, simple and time-worn, became extensions of the cook's hands. They told stories with every mark and burn. They fed families, day after day, season after season. In a world without electricity or timers, the medieval kitchen was alive with motion, scent, and sound. And at its centre, always, was the hearth. In the world of medieval cooking, seasoning was an art of balance, not just of taste, but of access and tradition. While our modern pantries might be lined with jars of vibrant spices and ready-made blends, the medieval kitchen relied on fewer, simpler ingredients. Yet even with modest means, cooks across Europe found creative ways to add flavour and warmth to their meals. For most people, seasoning began with salt. Salt was both precious and essential. It preserved meat, enhanced flavour, and was used to cure fish and vegetables. In inland areas, salt came in the form of coarse crystals, mined from the earth, or extracted from salt pans. Along coastal regions, it was often produced by evaporating seawater. The quality and accessibility of salt varied by region, and for many peasants, it was used sparingly. A small cloth-wrapped sack might last a household for weeks, even months. It was common to see a small ceramic or wooden container of salt sitting near the hearth or on a kitchen shelf, often covered with cloth to keep out dust and insects. A pinch could lift the flavour of porridge, bring out the sweetness in roasted carrots, or tenderize tougher cuts of meat when used in cooking water. Another common way to flavour meals was through the use of sour elements. Vinegar, for example, was widely used, made from fermented wine, beer, or cider. It added sharpness to stews, pickled vegetables for storage, and helped preserve foods through long winters. A splash of vinegar stirred into pottage, or drizzled over beans and onions, created a tangy depth that broke through the heaviness of grains and root vegetables. Fermented sauces also found their way into cooking pots. In parts of Europe, especially near the Mediterranean, cooks used sauces like garum, a fermented fish liquid dating back to Roman times, to season meat and vegetables. While garum became less common in the north, similar condiments persisted in local forms, made from anchovies, herbs, and salt. Their pungency added complexity to otherwise mild ingredients. Herbs were another foundational seasoning. Unlike exotic spices, herbs could be grown just outside the kitchen door. Common choices included parsley, sage, thyme, rosemary, dill, and mint. These were gathered fresh in spring and summer, and dried in bunches hung from ceiling beams for winter use. Even a few chopped leaves could transform a pot of beans or a plate of boiled greens. Garlic and onions played an enormous role in everyday flavour. Sautéed in animal fat or boiled with vegetables, they form the base of many dishes. Their sharp bite mellowed with cooking, providing richness without needing additional seasoning. Some cooks even rubbed garlic on bread or meat before roasting, allowing the flavour to linger subtly in the background. For wealthier households, especially in noble kitchens and monasteries with trade connections, spices added a new dimension to meals. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, saffron, cloves, and nutmeg were imported at great cost from Asia and the Middle East. These spices arrived via long trade routes and were often stored in locked chests under the steward's control. A pinch of cinnamon in a meat stew or a thread of saffron in a rice dish was not just a flavour choice. It was a symbol of wealth and refinement. These rare spices were used carefully, often reserved for feasts or religious occasions. Recipes recorded in medieval cookbooks, written in Latin or courtly French, called for elaborate combinations, blending sweet and savoury in ways that might surprise the modern palate. Almond milk, rosewater, and sugar might appear in the same dish as minced meat and vinegar, creating complex perfumed meals meant to impress. Even among the elite, though, simpler flavours held value. Roasted meats were basted with butter and herbs. Breads were sprinkled with coarse salt or brushed with egg for a golden finish. Fresh fruit, like apples and pears, was stewed with honey or spiced wine. In monasteries, where simplicity was a virtue, seasoning was subtle and careful. Herbs from the cloister garden flavoured stews and soups, while cheese and salted fish added richness. On fasting days, almond milk replaced dairy, and spices like cumin or coriander might be used in moderation. For the peasantry, seasoning was rooted in what could be grown, gathered, or bartered. But even with limited means, meals were not bland. A stew simmered with garlic, parsley, and salt was deeply comforting. A crust of bread dipped in herb vinegar carried surprising brightness, and a hot bowl of porridge with leeks and onions, carefully seasoned, brought warmth to the coldest morning. In the medieval kitchen, flavour was coaxed, not commanded. It was the result of attention, tradition, and respect for ingredients. Each meal told a quiet story, not of extravagance, but of care. In medieval Europe, what people drank was not just a matter of taste, but one of safety and survival. Clean water was often unreliable. Rivers and wells were shared with animals, used for washing, or contaminated by nearby waste. The fear of illness made people cautious, and so they turned to other options, drinks that were brewed, fermented, or boiled, to quench their thirst. Water was still consumed, of course, especially in rural areas with access to clear streams or deep, well-maintained springs. In some villages, stone wells were protected with wooden lids and cared for by the entire community. The clearest water might be reserved for children or the sick, and even then, it was often boiled first. But in most households, water alone was considered suspect. Instead, one of the most common drinks of the time was something called small beer. Small beer was a very weak form of ale, typically containing less than 1% alcohol. It wasn't brewed for intoxication, but for hydration. Because the brewing process involved boiling the water and fermenting the grain, it helped kill harmful bacteria and made the drink safer than untreated water. Even children drank it, often multiple times a day. This beer was made from grains, usually barley, and brewed in large wooden tubs. A single batch might produce strong ale in the first drawing, and weaker, more diluted small beer in the second or third. Families who brewed at home often reused the same grain mash several times, ensuring nothing was wasted. Small beer was cloudy, sour, and only lightly fizzy. It was served in wooden mugs or ceramic jugs and kept near the hearth to stay warm during colder months. In the summer, it might be poured into cool clay pots and stored in shaded corners of the home. It wasn't a drink for celebration. It was simply a part of everyday life. In towns and cities, ale houses and taverns brewed their own batches for sale. These places didn't just serve the community. They were centres of news, gatherings, and rest for travellers. Alewives, women who brewed and sold beer, were a familiar sight. Many households supplemented their income this way, hanging a broom or cloth outside the door to signal fresh ale was available. For the wealthy, drinks were more varied. Stronger ale, wine, mead, and even imported liquors were part of their tables, especially during feasts. Red wine came from southern Europe and was often spiced, diluted, or mixed with honey. Mead, made from fermented honey, was sweet and reserved for special occasions. Monasteries brewed some of the best beer in the land. Monks, skilled in both brewing and record-keeping, developed recipes that were consistent and flavorful. Their beer was used not only in their own meals, but offered to pilgrims and visitors. Some abbeys became known far and wide for the quality of their drink, and their brewing methods influenced regional practices for centuries. In poorer homes, other beverages supplemented the day. Cider, made from fermented apples, was common in orchard-rich regions. It could be sharp or sweet, depending on the fruit and method. Perry, made from pears, was a variation with a lighter taste. These drinks required access to trees and presses, so they were more seasonal and localized. Milk, though available, was usually not consumed in large amounts. Fresh milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration, so it was often turned into butter or cheese instead. Still, children might drink it warm in the morning if the family kept goats or cows. In warmer months, herbal infusions became more popular. Cooks steeped mint, chamomile, sage, or elderflower in hot water to create soothing teas. These were used both for enjoyment and medicinal purposes, offering comfort for colds, fatigue, or stomach ailments. Such drinks were calming and fragrant, made with herbs gathered from nearby fields or monastery gardens. While modern kitchens have taps and kettles, the medieval home depended on barrels, jugs, and careful storage. Water was fetched daily, carried in buckets from streams or wells. Ale was brewed in cycles and rationed to last the week. Jugs were stopped with cloth or wax to keep flies out, and mugs were rinsed at the end of each meal, not for sparkle, but to avoid souring the next drink. In every kitchen, a space near the hearth was reserved for drinks. A row of jugs lined up on a shelf, a bucket filled and covered, a small ladle resting nearby. People drank often, not out of luxury, but to stay nourished, hydrated, and ready for the labour each day demanded. In this quiet routine of lifting a mug, sharing a jug, or sipping from a bowl, the medieval home stayed connected, not only to tradition, but to the land and its careful, time-honoured rhythms. By the time the sun reached its peak and shadows shortened in the courtyards outside, the castle kitchen was alive with motion. While the noble household dined on schedules far removed from the peasant rhythm of sunrise and sunset, the castle's kitchen staff had long been at work. Their day began before dawn, and by midday, the entire room buzzed with quiet urgency. The castle kitchen was typically located on the ground floor or in an adjacent building, often near the buttery and pantry, but far enough from the main halls to keep the heat and smoke away. Thick stone walls trapped warmth, while narrow windows offered ventilation and a dim, filtered light. Fires roared in open hearths, one for each purpose: roasting meat, boiling stews, baking bread, and heating water. At the centre of it all stood the master cook, overseeing every pot, pan, and ladle. Tables were covered in ingredients: freshly plucked herbs, quartered onions, bowls of butter, eels in water-filled basins, and legs of mutton rubbed with salt. Servants moved around the space with practiced speed. One stirred a copper cauldron while another scraped carrots into a basket. Two boys stood at a spit, rotating it rhythmically, their hands blackened with soot. Near the baking hearth, round loaves of fine white bread cooled on wooden racks. These were not the dark, dense loaves of village homes. This bread was made with refined wheat flour, sifted to remove coarse bran and baked in ovens, hot from hours of firewood. Beside the loaves, a tray of tarts was being prepared, filled with chopped pears, honey, and a blend of spices too costly for most kitchens: cinnamon, cloves, and a hint of saffron. From the rafters hung garlands of drying herbs, strings of garlic bulbs, and bunches of onions. Along the far wall, barrels held flour, oats, vinegar, and ale. Copper pots were stacked neatly by size, their bottoms blackened and dented. Wooden bowls soaked in a tub of water. Everything had its place, and everyone had their task. The meal being prepared might serve dozens, not just the lord and lady of the manor, but their guests, knights, squires, visiting clergy, and personal attendants. Even their hounds had meals prepared in the scullery, where bones and scraps were set aside. The castle kitchen was a hub of production, feeding a small village under one roof. In addition to the main cook, there were bakers, brewers, butchers, and assistants for each. The spicer, often a trusted and well-paid servant, handled the rarest ingredients, carefully measuring nutmeg, ginger, and pepper from locked boxes. These spices were recorded meticulously, used in tiny amounts, and added only at the final stages of cooking. In the middle of the room stood the serving table, where finished dishes were arranged. A roast peacock with its feathers restored and spread for display. A stew of river trout with leeks and cream. A dish of boiled barley mixed with dried currants and sweetened with honey. Each plate, bowl, and trenching board was set with a purpose, waiting to be carried upstairs to the great hall. The food was not rushed. Despite the bustle, each step took time. Stews simmered slowly. Breads were baked in measured heat. Roasts were basted repeatedly to crisp the skin without drying the meat. The cook knew which dishes to serve hot, which to prepare in advance, and which to present purely for their visual beauty. Beyond the visible flurry of work, there was order. Apprentices moved quietly, listening for instructions. Young girls plucked herbs or peeled apples near the window. Older servants fetched water from the courtyard well or poured oil into clay lamps as the light shifted. Outside, the scent of roasting meat and fresh bread drifted through the castle's stone corridors. Nobles walking from their chambers might pause, breathe in deeply, and feel the anticipation of the meal to come. Their table would be long, the dishes many, the service formal. But it all began here, in the warmth and smoke of the kitchen. As the final touches were placed, a garnish of parsley, a twist of roasted dough, a splash of wine in the gravy, the steward arrived to inspect the platters. With a nod of approval, the food was lifted and carried away, up the stairs to the hall, where silver platters gleamed and tapestries whispered behind closed doors. And just like that, the kitchen began again, cleaning, restocking, planning for the next meal. Because in a castle, eating was not a moment. It was a cycle. And behind every noble feast was a fire, a pot, and the steady rhythm of hands that cooked without pause. In the medieval kitchen, no task drew more attention, or more admiration, than the roasting of meat. It was a spectacle of smell and sound, a slow and smoky ritual that turned raw flesh into golden, glistening meals. Whether in the halls of a great castle or the yard of a modest home, the act of roasting was both art and labour, carried out with skill and patience beside the fire's deep, glowing heart. The most common method of roasting involved the spit, a long iron rod or wooden pole pierced through the meat and suspended over the flame. This spit was slowly turned to ensure even cooking, allowing the heat to crisp the skin while sealing in the juices. In noble kitchens, the spit might be supported by metal brackets or chains, adjustable for height and angle. The meat could be lowered closer to the coals or raised to avoid burning, depending on its size and the fire's temperament. Large roasts were reserved for those who could afford them. Whole pigs, legs of venison, fat capons, or even swans, dressed and displayed with restored feathers. For feasts, a single spit might carry multiple birds, bound with twine and rubbed with lard, turning slowly while cooks basted them with a mixture of butter, herbs, and dripping fat collected in pans below. The scent of roasting meat filled the castle's lower halls, carried through open doorways and high windows. Servants paused their chores to inhale the aroma. Dogs circled near the hearth, noses lifted, tails wagging. The sound of fat hissing on the coals and the crackling skin was as much a signal of celebration as the toll of a bell. Yet the work was long and demanding. The spit had to be turned continuously, not too fast, or the outside would cook while the inside remained raw, not too slow, or the meat would burn on one side. In many kitchens, this job was given to a servant known as the spit boy. Often a child or young apprentice, the spit boy knelt beside the fire for hours, turning a handle or pushing the rod by hand. His face reddened by heat, eyes watering from smoke. He was a quiet but essential figure in the rhythm of the kitchen. Some larger kitchens developed mechanical aids, weight-driven or water-powered turning mechanisms, but these were rare. More often, it was muscle and time that kept the meat rotating. To add flavour, cooks used basting brushes made from cloth or bundled herbs, tied to wooden sticks. These were dipped into a mixture of wine, vinegar, or broth, and drizzled over the roast at intervals. The meat would darken and glisten, its scent deepening with every brush stroke. Beneath the spit, a wide, shallow pan caught the drippings. These were used to make rich sauces, blended with flour, spices, or fruit. The resulting gravies were poured over the meat when served or set aside for dipping with bread. In noble households, these sauces were sometimes sweetened with raisins or dates and perfumed with cloves or mace. For those of lower means, roasting was simpler. A small bird, a rabbit, or a piece of pork might be skewered on a stick and held over the hearth. Twisting it slowly by hand, the cook would watch for the skin to blister, then pull it back to avoid charring. There were no pans to catch the juices. Instead, the meat was eaten with bread to soak up every drop. Ashes were brushed aside with a wooden spoon, and the fire's heat was judged by instinct, not instruments. Clay ovens, when available, allowed for indirect roasting, sealing meat in a container and placing it inside a preheated dome of stone or earth. The result was tender, steamed meat with a milder flavour, often used for dishes with herbs and wine. But it was the open flame that captured imaginations. Roasting by fire was not merely cooking, it was performance. During great feasts, roasting spits were displayed openly. Guests might pass the kitchen and admire the scale of the preparations. The turning of the meat was a symbol of the household's wealth, generosity, and command over fire itself. After the meal, the remains of the roast were carefully collected. Bones were set aside for dogs or for boiling into broth. Fat was stored for future cooking. Leftover meat was chopped and added to the next day's stew or baked into pies. Nothing was wasted, for every roast represented not just a meal, but days of planning, labour, and cost. And when the fire dimmed and the spit grew still, the scent of the roast lingered in the warm stones of the hearth, a quiet echo of the work that had passed and the feast that had been shared. In medieval Europe, food wasn't just dictated by what was available, it was deeply shaped by the rhythms of religion. Among the many traditions that governed daily life, one of the most enduring was the practice of abstaining from meat on Fridays. This custom, rooted in Christian observance, turned one day each week into a distinct culinary experience centered on fish. For peasants and nobles alike, Friday meals required thought and adjustment. Meat from land animals, including beef, pork, lamb, and even poultry, was forbidden on these days. In its place, the diet turned to water-dwelling creatures, fish from rivers, lakes, seas, and streams, as well as eels, crustaceans, and sometimes even aquatic birds, depending on regional interpretation. This regular restriction shaped both what people ate and how food was gathered, preserved, and prepared. In coastal regions, Friday was just another day to enjoy what the sea had to offer. Markets near the shore bustled with activity, selling fresh cod, herring, mussels, and flatfish. Fishermen mended their nets at dawn and returned with their catch by midday, laying it out on straw mats or wooden tables for the townsfolk to inspect. Inland, the story was different. Fresh fish was a luxury, often difficult to obtain and expensive. Streams and rivers provided trout, perch, and eels, but only for those who had the rights to fish, which were usually granted by the local lord or monastery. Poaching, though illegal, was common, especially among the poor who needed to meet religious obligations without starving. To overcome the challenge of distance and perishability, medieval cooks relied on preserved fish. Salted cod, dried in the open air until hard and white, could be transported over great distances. It was soaked in water for a day or two to soften before being boiled or stewed with onions and herbs. Pickled herring, packed in barrels with vinegar and spices, offered a sharp and tangy flavour that was prized across the continent. Smoked fish, like eel or haddock, had a rich, oily taste and could be eaten as is or added to stews. In some regions, fish was packed in clay and baked in coals, a rustic yet effective method for cooking without drying it out. Monasteries with access to fish ponds carefully managed their stocks, ensuring a steady supply of carp or tench for the brothers' Friday table. Eels deserve a special mention. Slimy but abundant, they were considered both nutritious and acceptable fare for fasting. Eel pies, stewed eels, and even jellied eels became staples, particularly in England. They were caught in weirs and baskets set along riverbanks and were often prepared with vinegar, herbs, and sometimes mustard seed to offset their oily nature. In wealthier households, Friday meals were an opportunity to display culinary creativity. Almond milk, made by grinding almonds with water and straining the result, became a popular dairy substitute during fasts. Cooks used it as a base for creamy fish sauces, soups, and even sweet dishes. Spices like saffron, ginger, and cloves elevated simple fish into luxurious fare. And decorative pies shaped like fish were sometimes served more for their beauty than their taste. Eggs and dairy were sometimes allowed depending on local interpretation and clerical rulings, though stricter orders forbade them. In these households, fish and grains formed the backbone of Friday meals. A thick fish stew served with bread, flavoured with onions and greens from the garden, was both satisfying and compliant with the church's expectations. For the very poor, Friday meals could be as simple as a handful of boiled peas, a piece of dried bread rubbed with garlic, and a spoonful of vinegar. But even in these cases, the intention remained to observe the day, to sacrifice something, and to find a different rhythm from the rest of the week. The church calendar included many other fasting days beyond Fridays, Advent, Lent, and the vigils of saints' days, all of which reinforced this deep connection between faith and food. Over time, cooks developed an entire repertoire of fish dishes, refining techniques and passing down traditions that would shape cuisine for generations. So, in the medieval kitchen, as the end of the week approached, preparations shifted. The meat was set aside, the fish brought forward, and the fire adjusted to a gentler heat. A different scent filled the air, salty, smoky, often sharp. A reminder that food was more than sustenance. It was devotion, discipline, and the quiet expression of belief, served hot in a simple bowl beside the fire. In the tapestry of medieval life, there were days when the kitchen fire grew hotter and the cooking pots doubled in size. These were the days of gatherings, when weddings were celebrated, harvests completed, or saints honoured. And on those rare but significant occasions, a single hearth was not enough. The whole village came together to eat, work, and share the bounty of what they had. Feeding an entire village wasn't something done casually. It required planning, cooperation, and the pooling of resources. In small communities, everyone contributed something: a sack of grain, a jug of ale, a wheel of cheese, or a freshly slaughtered pig. These communal meals weren't held every week, but when they came around, they left a lasting impression, remembered in song and in story for years to come. The preparations began days in advance. The village's women gathered in the central green or at the manor's kitchen, chopping vegetables, kneading dough, and tending to the simmering pots. Children were sent to fetch water, gather firewood, or run messages between homes. Men helped build cooking fires outside, setting up crude brick or stone ovens, or digging pits for roasting whole animals. Large cauldrons were borrowed or shared. These iron pots were so big that they had to be lifted by 2 people and suspended over roaring fires. In them, thick pottage was made, a stew of barley, beans, leeks, carrots, and whatever meat could be spared. If the harvest had been good, the pot might include pork or mutton chopped and seared before being added to the mix. If it was a religious feast, fish or eel might replace the meat. Bread was baked in massive batches using the communal oven. Village bakehouses, when available, became the busiest places in town. Loaves were marked with symbols to indicate whose was whose, and the air filled with the deep scent of toasted flour and ash. Flatbreads were also made and cooked on griddles or stones near the fire. Fast, simple, and ready to eat while warm. Cheeses, made weeks or months earlier, were unwrapped and shared. Pickled vegetables were opened, their lids sealed with wax or cloth. Butter, churned in the early morning, was laid out on wooden boards beside baskets of bread. Bowls of dried fruit, nuts, and honeycombs were passed from hand to hand. In many places, the feast took place outside. Long tables were built from wooden planks set on barrels or crates. Benches and stools surrounded them, and on fair days, the meal was eaten under the open sky. Garlanded with herbs and fresh flowers, the setting felt festive, even magical. In poor weather, meals moved into barns or halls, wherever there was space. Ale flowed freely. Brewed in large batches by local alewives or monks, it was served in jugs or pails, scooped into mugs with wooden ladles. It was not just drink, it was celebration, shared warmth, and the glue of conversation. For one evening, the hardships of life seemed further away. Entertainment often accompanied the meal. Musicians played lutes or flutes. Storytellers stood by the fire, recounting tales of saints, heroes, and long-past feasts. Dancers stomped in rhythm. Children laughed. And the air buzzed with more than just food. It was full of life. Feeding a village was also symbolic. It was a moment of equality, where lord and serf, old and young, shared the same dishes. The manor might supply the meat, the church the spices, but the community made the meal together. In some traditions, the lord would serve his tenants, carving meat at the head of the table as a gesture of unity and gratitude. After the meal, as the sun dipped low, the fire was stoked one last time. Leftovers were gathered, bones picked clean, and bread crusts swept from the table. Some food was wrapped in cloth for those who couldn't attend, the sick, the elderly, or the poor. Nothing was wasted, and when the fires finally faded into embers, the village was fed, not just in body, but in spirit. These meals, few as they were, reminded everyone of their shared place, their common work, and their ability to create something meaningful from the simplest of ingredients. It was a meal of gratitude, a meal of connection, and a memory carried into the long, quiet days that followed. In the medieval kitchen, dairy was a precious and perishable gift. From milk came butter, cheese, cream, and curds, ingredients that added richness to humble meals and variety to diets centered on grains and vegetables. Though not as abundant as bread or pottage, dairy products were valued by all who had access to animals, and cooking with dairy brought comfort, nourishment, and a touch of indulgence to the medieval table. Milk came mostly from cows, but in many areas, goats and sheep were just as important. Goats, in particular, were favoured in rougher terrain where cattle could not graze easily. They required less space and produced milk that was easier to digest. Sheep's milk was richer, higher in fat, and excellent for cheese making. Cows, when kept, provided larger quantities but required more land and fodder, a luxury only some peasants or monastic communities could manage. Fresh milk was rarely stored for long. Without refrigeration, it soured quickly, especially in warmer months. As a result, most milk was either consumed immediately or transformed into other forms. It might be poured over porridge in the morning, stirred into stews to mellow sharp flavors, or used to make soft curds by gently heating and adding vinegar or rennet. These curds, sprinkled with herbs or honey, became simple but satisfying dishes, a medieval version of cottage cheese. Butter was a staple in many households, especially in regions with cooler climates. It was made by churning cream, usually by hand, in a wooden tub or barrel. The churning could take an hour or more, with a rhythmic push and pull that required both strength and patience. Eventually, the fat separated from the buttermilk, forming soft yellow clumps that were pressed into wooden molds and washed with cold water. Butter was then salted to preserve it longer, especially if it wasn't to be used right away. In the kitchen, butter was melted and drizzled over cooked vegetables, added to pastries, or used to fry eggs and onions. It brought flavour and richness to even the simplest fare. A slice of bread spread with butter paired with a piece of cheese, was a common lunch for workers in the field. In noble households, butter might be mixed with herbs and served as a sauce for fish or poultry. Cheese was the true keeper of dairy's gifts. Made by curdling milk and pressing the solids, it could last for weeks or months, depending on how it was treated. Soft cheeses were eaten fresh, often flavoured with garlic or chives. Hard cheeses were aged and carried from market to market, wrapped in cloth or wax. Monasteries became centres of cheese-making, with monks developing techniques still used today. Each region had its own methods, flavours and shapes: round wheels, square blocks, or wrapped cones. Cheese appeared in many dishes. It was grated into soups, layered into pies, or eaten with fruit for dessert. On fasting days, when meat was forbidden, cheese remained permissible in most traditions, providing protein and fat to those observing religious rules. In wealthier kitchens, it was even baked into elaborate tarts with eggs, herbs, and saffron, served warm in small ceramic bowls. Cream, though rarer, was used in luxurious recipes. Skimmed from the top of fresh milk and kept cool in cellars, cream was added to sweet sauces or poured over fruits in the summer months. In courtly cookbooks, it appeared in dishes meant to impress: custards, flans, and sweetened porridges flavoured with rosewater or almond milk. Such indulgences were reserved for feast days, weddings, or high holidays. But even in the simplest homes, dairy brought joy. Children drank warm milk before bed. Farmers spread buttermilk on slices of dark bread. Wives wrapped rounds of cheese in cloth and stored them in root cellars. Butter was shaped into patties and stored in ceramic jars, sometimes buried in cool earth to keep it from melting. In towns, dairymaids delivered milk in clay pitchers, walking from house to house in the early morning, calling out their presence. In some villages, cows were grazed communally and milk was shared or traded. During spring and summer, when animals gave more milk, kitchens buzzed with activity, churning, curdling, and cooking. In winter, the supply dwindled, and what had been stored was used sparingly. Dairy was not just food, it was a sign of rhythm, care, and connection to the animals that fed the household. It reminded people of the seasons, of labour, and of reward. Every spoonful of butter, slice of cheese, or sip of milk was the product of time, touch, and trust. And in a world where every meal required effort, dairy brought a certain softness, a richness that comforted and sustained. For most people in the Middle Ages, life was filled with labour, routine, and simple meals. But even in the hardest of times, there was always a place for something sweet. Whether it came at the end of a feast or on a holy day, the appearance of a small treat, a bite of honey cake, a dried fruit, or a sip of spiced wine, offered comfort, celebration, and just a little luxury in an otherwise modest world. Sugar, as we know it today, was rare and expensive. Imported from the East through long, dangerous trade routes, it was considered a spice, used in tiny amounts, and kept under lock and key in wealthier homes. Most medieval cooks relied instead on honey to sweeten their dishes. Honey was the most common sweetener, gathered from wild hives or kept by villagers in woven bee skeps placed near gardens and orchards. Honey had many uses. It was drizzled over fresh cheese, stirred into porridge, mixed into dough for sweetbreads, or used as a glaze for roasted nuts. Some homes made honey cakes, thick, dense loaves spiced with cinnamon, cloves, or ginger when available. These were often baked during religious festivals, weddings, or important feasts, their rich scent filling the house with anticipation. Dried fruits were another favourite. Grapes were laid out in the sun to become raisins, plums turned into prunes, and apples sliced thin and hung near the hearth to dry slowly. In monasteries, this was done in great quantities, with brothers turning racks of fruit to ensure even drying. These treats were stored in sacks or clay pots and added to dishes during the winter months when fresh fruit was scarce. In noble homes, sweet dishes became far more elaborate. Cookbooks from the time described jellies made with wine and fruit, custards thickened with eggs and flavoured with rosewater, and fritters, dough balls fried in lard and rolled in sugar or honey. Saffron, though costly, was used to add a golden colour to rice puddings and almond pastes. Almond milk itself, made by grinding almonds with water and straining the mixture, served as a creamy base for many desserts, especially on fasting days when dairy was forbidden. Spiced wine, known as hippocras, was another common indulgence among the wealthy. Red wine was simmered with sugar, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and sometimes dried fruit, then strained and served warm. It was both a drink and a dessert, soothing, fragrant, and a sign that the feast had reached its final course. But sweets weren't only for nobles. In villages, cooks made simple oatcakes mixed with honey and herbs. Children were given slices of baked apple with a sprinkle of cinnamon, or bits of cheese wrapped in dough and baked until golden. On market days or at fairs, vendors sold candied nuts, dried fruits, and strips of sweetened pastry, all made in advance and carried in baskets wrapped in cloth. During the holidays, Christmas, Easter, and midsummer festivals, every household tried to prepare something special, a sweet pudding made from leftover grains, milk, and honey, a fruit tart baked in a shallow pan, a syrup made from rose petals or elderflowers. These small indulgences were often shared with neighbours, carried across the village wrapped in linen or tucked into baskets lined with herbs. In some communities, sweets were tied to specific rituals. Honey cakes might be left at church altars, or shared with travellers as a gesture of hospitality. Dried dates and figs were eaten during Lent, a reminder of both biblical lands and the scarcity of the season. On saints' feast days, children received sweetened buns or biscuits shaped into animals or flowers. Even in the poorest homes, a bit of sweetness could be found. A spoon of honey stirred into hot water made a comforting drink. A baked turnip with butter and salt, while not truly sweet, still felt like a treat after days of bland gruel. The idea was not to indulge, but to honour the moment, to mark time with taste. And so, in every medieval kitchen, there was a shelf or a jar or a corner drawer where the special things were kept. A little honey, a few raisins, a bundle of dried herbs for tea. They were used carefully, joyfully, and always with meaning. Because in a world of hard work and harder winters, the taste of sweetness, no matter how small, was something to be remembered. Step into a medieval kitchen, not with your eyes, but with your ears and nose. Close them gently, and let the world of clattering spoons, bubbling pots, and fragrant hearth fires surround you. For as much as the medieval kitchen was a place of tools and ingredients, it was equally a place of atmosphere, a warm, sensory cocoon that told you, even before you saw it, that something was being made with care. It begins with the fire, the low crackle of logs slowly burning down to embers, the occasional pop of sap bursting in the wood, the whisper of flame licking the sides of a blackened pot. Fire was constant, tended gently, adjusted often. Too strong and the stew would scorch. Too weak and the bread would bake unevenly. The cook knew its moods by sound alone. There was the soft thump of a wooden spoon against a cauldron's edge, tapping off drips between stirs. The steady rhythm of kneading dough echoed on a wooden board, palms pressing, folding, pressing again. A knife scratched through a root vegetable, its tip clicking softly against the bottom of a bowl. Somewhere nearby, water trickled from a ladle into a clay jug, its splash gentle, brief. In a larger kitchen, multiple sounds layered like a quiet symphony. Grain being ground in a hand mill with a slow, stone-on-stone shuffle. A ladle scraping the sides of a porridge pot. The brushing of ashes from a baking stone. The hollow thud of a cleaver striking a cutting block. The soft hiss of butter meeting a hot pan. Conversations, if present, were murmured. Cooks called out instructions. Helpers answered with nods or short replies. Occasionally, the sudden hiss of steam would rise as water hit a hot surface, followed by a brief silence as everyone turned to look. Did the pot boil over? Was something lost? Then the rhythm returned, and hands continued their work. The smells were even more telling. First, the hearth itself, warm, smoky, earthy, a scent that clung to clothes and hair and never quite left, even after the fire died down. Then the scent of bread, rising with the heat, toasty and full. It wrapped around the kitchen like a blanket, telling everyone that food was near, that hunger would soon be eased. There was the sharp bite of onion being chopped, making eyes water even in the dim light. Garlic, crushed under a stone or the flat of a knife, released its pungent, savoury oil. Herbs added their notes in quiet bursts. Thyme, mint, parsley, green and fresh, a contrast to the heavy smells of roasting and boiling. When meat was on the spit, the scent was unmistakable. Rich, fatty, and slowly deepening as the drippings fell and sizzled in the fire below. If fish was being cooked, the air took on a briny tang, softened by butter or herbs. Soups and pottages gave off a mellow, layered aroma. Barley, leeks, and root vegetables mingling into something familiar and filling. In noble kitchens, spices made their entrance. The sweet scent of cinnamon and cloves when tarts were baked. The floral touch of rosewater added to custards. The deep musk of saffron or nutmeg stirred into sauces. These were rare notes, but when present, they transformed the space into something extraordinary. Even the less pleasant smells told a story. The tang of vinegar used for pickling or washing, the faint sourness of curdling milk, the earthy scent of damp root vegetables brought up from cellars. In a world without refrigeration, everything had a smell and a time. Cooks learned to trust their noses as much as their eyes. Despite all of this, the kitchen was not chaotic. It was calm, almost meditative. Everyone knew their role, and the sounds were part of a quiet language spoken through movement. A spoon placed beside a bowl. A pot lid lifted, then set down again. A loaf removed from the oven with a satisfied tap. These were small acts, but they filled the space with intention. And so, standing in the middle of this medieval kitchen, you would hear the breath of the home itself, in bubbling broth, in crackling fire, in rustling cloth. You would smell its heart, in fresh bread, in stew, in herbs warming on the shelf. And even without a single word, you would know, this is where care lives. This is where time is transformed, gently, into nourishment. As the sun dipped lower in the sky and the shadows stretched across the cobbled courtyards, the noble household prepared for dinner, the day's grandest and most ceremonial meal. Unlike the hurried or practical meals of peasants, dinner in a lord's manor or castle was an event, a display of wealth, hospitality, and refinement. It was where food met pageantry, where ingredients and presentation were as important as flavour, and where the kitchen's earlier chaos transformed into silent procession. Dinner was often served in the great hall, a large, vaulted chamber with stone walls hung in tapestries and banners. A long wooden table stood at the centre, flanked by benches, with the high table raised slightly at one end for the lord, lady, and their honoured guests. Below them sat knights, courtiers, scribes, and visiting clergy, all placed according to rank and favour. But before the guests could enter, the kitchen had to be ready. Hours of preparation led to this moment. The kitchen, now quieter, arranged its final dishes under the careful eye of the master cook. Platters were wiped clean, garnishes adjusted, sauces ladled just so. Dishes were laid out in courses, not all at once, but in measured waves, each one telling part of the story. The first course might include lighter fare, cold meats, pickled vegetables, savoury pies, and slices of cheese. Bread, always freshly baked and white for the high table, was cut in thick slices and served with butter or spreadable cheese. Small jugs of ale or wine were placed at regular intervals alongside silver or pewter cups. Then came the procession. Servants, dressed in clean tunics, walked 2 by 2 from the kitchen to the hall, each carrying a dish in both hands. Some bore great silver trays with roasted birds arranged in layers. Others carried glazed earthenware filled with thick stews, their lids steaming. A few presented more theatrical creations, swan redressed in feathers, pies shaped like castles or ships, fish arranged to appear swimming on a platter of greens and herbs. The smells were intoxicating, a mixture of meat, spice, warm bread, and fresh herbs. As each course was announced by the steward, guests would nod, comment, or murmur their approval. Musicians in the gallery above played soft lute or flute melodies, and the clinking of knives and spoons soon joined the music. Utensils were basic, even here. Knives were used to cut and lift food to the mouth. Spoons served for broths and custards. Forks were rare, sometimes reserved for the highest nobility, and used mostly for serving rather than eating. Fingers, clean and deliberate, did most of the work, and cloth napkins were tucked into belts or laid across laps. Conversation filled the room, polite, political, personal. The meal was not rushed. Each course brought its own pace. The second course often featured heavier dishes: roasted beef, stewed game, or poached fish in almond milk. Side dishes of beans, turnips, and leeks were passed around. Some served in trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that acted as edible plates. Dessert, when it arrived, was not just sweet. It was a display. Tarts of pear and apple, custards flavoured with saffron, dishes of preserved fruit, candied nuts, and little spiced wafers dusted with sugar. A jug of hippocras, spiced wine, made its way around the high table, poured with care into finely made cups. Throughout the dinner, servers remained alert. They refilled jugs, replaced dishes, and tended to any special requests. In wealthier households, the lord might keep a food taster nearby, a servant who sampled dishes before they reached the high table, ensuring they were not poisoned, a real concern in times of unrest. By the time the final course was cleared, the candles had burned low, and the fire in the great hearth had become a glowing heap of coals. A soft haze hung in the air, and bellies were full. Guests leaned back on benches, spoke more slowly, or rose to retire. Some lingered for music or storytelling, while others strolled out into the cool evening air. The kitchen, meanwhile, began its work anew, cleaning, cooling, storing what could be saved. Bones were collected for broth. Crumbs were swept from the flagstone floor. Dishes were rinsed in basins of warm water, dried with cloths and stacked for tomorrow. But for now, the noble dinner had ended. Not just a meal, but a performance. And in the memory of each guest, long after the tastes had faded, the warmth of the fire, the scent of roasted meat, and the soft notes of music remained. Behind every steaming plate, every crusty loaf, every well-seasoned stew laid before a noble or monk, stood the quiet labour of servants and cooks, the unseen hands of the medieval kitchen. While lords and ladies dined in candle-lit halls and monks sat in ordered silence in refectories, the kitchen staff worked in the background, methodically, patiently, and often in exhausting conditions. They were the rhythm keepers of the household, and without them, no meal would ever come to be. In large estates or castles, the kitchen was staffed by a full hierarchy of workers, each with their own tasks and responsibilities. At the top stood the master cook, a position of real authority and respect. The master cook oversaw all food preparation, from ingredient sourcing to the timing and plating of dishes. He, or in rarer cases she, managed supplies, trained apprentices, and coordinated with stewards and butlers about upcoming feasts or special dietary needs. A good master cook was as valuable as a trusted knight, ensuring not only nourishment but also prestige. Beneath the master cook were kitchen boys, pot scrubbers, spit turners, herb cutters, and wood carriers. Each role was essential, even if menial. Spit turners, often children or young servants, spent hours kneeling near the fire, their skin singed red as they slowly rotated roasting meats. Pot scrubbers scraped cauldrons with bundles of herbs or rough linen, removing burnt bits and fat so they could be reused the next day. Water carriers hauled bucket after bucket from nearby wells or streams, often navigating steep stairs and slippery floors. Cooks assigned to specific stations worked with what we might today call specialties. There might be a saucier responsible for sauces and gravies, a pastry cook who made tarts and pies, or a baker who tended to the rising loaves and the ever-glowing bread ovens. In monastic kitchens, where order and repetition were prized, the rhythm of their work resembled prayer, precise, quiet, and uninterrupted. Despite the order, conditions were hard. The kitchen was hot, smoky, and crowded. Large hearths burned constantly, making summer days especially unbearable. Cuts, burns, and smoke inhalation were common, and there were no gloves or aprons beyond simple cloth. The smell of fish, sweat, and meat mingled with the scent of herbs and smoke. And yet, the staff moved with focus, each motion born from repetition and skill. Women played a significant role, especially in village homes and smaller manors. While noble kitchens were often staffed by men, many household cooks were women who managed meals, preserved food, and passed down recipes by memory. A mother might teach her daughter to churn butter, stew lentils, or bake a savoury pie, not by written instruction but by feel, taste, and smell. In monasteries, the kitchener, a monk appointed to oversee meals, worked alongside lay brothers who performed much of the manual labour. Monastic kitchens operated on tight schedules, coordinating with the bells that rang for prayer and meals. Meals were served with reverence and silence, but behind the scenes, the cooks worked with the same fire, the same knives, the same time-worn pots. Outside of grand estates, village cooking relied on smaller-scale labour, but no less care. In homes with few tools and fewer ingredients, the woman of the house often did everything: gathering firewood, fetching water, preparing grain, cooking the meal, and washing up afterward. It was tiring, endless work, but it was also deeply embedded in daily life, a thread of comfort and stability through seasons of change. Servants and cooks weren't just functionaries. They were the memory keepers of flavor, the artists of aroma. They knew when to stir, when to taste, when to let a broth rest just a moment longer. They could tell if the fire was too hot by the crackle, if the stew needed more salt by the scent of the steam. Their names may not have been recorded. Their work was rarely celebrated. But the warmth that filled bellies, the smiles that followed full meals, the strength drawn from a hot dish on a cold day, all of that began in their hands. They were the heart of the medieval kitchen, unseen but never unneeded. As the food was prepared and carried forth from the firelit kitchens to tables grand or humble, there came another important element of medieval dining: how to eat. Table manners and utensils varied widely across classes, regions, and centuries, but they all reflected something deeper than custom, a sense of place, order, and respect for the shared meal. In the early medieval period, dining was a relatively informal affair, even in noble homes. Guests gathered around trestle tables that could be assembled and disassembled as needed. The high table, where the lord and honoured guests sat, was often elevated and covered with a cloth, a sign of status. Everyone else sat at lower tables, sometimes sharing benches or stools. The table was set simply. A cloth might cover the surface, and each diner was given a trencher, not a plate in the modern sense, but a thick slice of day-old bread. This bread acted as both plate and sponge, catching the juices from meat, stew, or sauce. After the meal, it could be eaten, given to the poor, or fed to dogs and pigs. Knives were the primary utensil. Each guest brought their own, often kept in a sheath at their belt. These knives were used for cutting meat, slicing bread, and spearing bites. There were no forks, not for most people. Forks began to appear in parts of Italy and Byzantium in the 11th century, but they were considered odd and even decadent by many in Western Europe. It wasn't until the very late Middle Ages that forks became more accepted, and even then, they were mostly used by the elite. Spoons were more common, especially for broths, stews, or dishes made with grains and sauces. They were made of wood, horn, or occasionally pewter or silver. The shape was simple, a round or oval bowl with a straight handle. A household might own a few, passed between family members, washed quickly, and returned to their place near the hearth. Eating with hands was perfectly normal and even expected, but it wasn't careless. Medieval etiquette books, particularly those written for young nobles or monks, stressed the importance of cleanliness and politeness. Wash your hands before eating. Don't lick your fingers too much. Don't reach across the table or take food with a knife that has been in your mouth. At formal meals, water basins were provided for washing, and a servant might offer a clean cloth for drying one's hands. Guests were seated according to rank, and food was served in order. The highest ranking person received their portion first. Plates, when used, were often shared between two people, making restraint and patience even more essential. Conversation was expected to be polite and calm. Loud laughter or chewing was frowned upon. One was not to slurp, belch, or speak with a full mouth. Bones were placed neatly on the side of the trencher, not thrown to the floor. Napkins, when available, were tucked into belts or placed across laps. In monasteries, meals were even more structured. Monks sat in silence, listening to readings from scripture as they ate. One monk, called the reader, stood at a lectern and recited passages while the others dined in quiet reflection. They used spoons and bread trenchers, and meals were modest: stews, vegetables, and simple porridge. Even their posture mattered. No elbows on the table, no signs of haste. In peasant homes, manners were simpler but still present. Families sat together around a shared bowl or platter, eating in rhythm, often in silence or with gentle conversation. Children were taught from a young age to eat slowly, to wait their turn, and to respect the food that had taken hours of labour to prepare. Hands were wiped on aprons or cloths. Jugs of ale or small beer were passed from one to another without complaint. Special feasts introduced more ceremony. In noble households, dishes were served with fanfare. Certain foods, like a roasted peacock or a spiced tart, were meant to be admired before they were eaten. The carving of meat was sometimes done by the Lord himself or by a designated carver, using special gestures that guests were expected to understand. Still, across all levels of society, the act of eating together carried weight. It was more than nourishment. It was connection to one's family, to one's community, to the land that grew the food and the hands that prepared it. Whether with a spoon carved from horn, a knife worn smooth from use, or a crust of bread cupped gently in the palm, the medieval diner approached the table with intention. And though the table might be rough-hewn or covered in fine linen, it always stood at the centre of something timeless, the quiet ritual of sharing a meal. The contrast between what was eaten on an ordinary day and what appeared during a medieval feast was as vast as the difference between village and castle. While daily meals focused on nourishment and simplicity, feasts were spectacles, extravagant displays of wealth, abundance, and culinary creativity. Understanding the difference between these two kinds of meals reveals much about medieval life, its rhythms, its values, and its aspirations. For most people, everyday food meant repetition. The staples were familiar: thick pottage made from grains and vegetables, coarse bread, small amounts of cheese, and perhaps a few scraps of salted meat or fish. Meals were eaten in silence or quiet conversation, prepared with what was on hand and adjusted to the season. They were satisfying but modest, meant to fuel a long day's work. But when it came time for a celebration, a wedding, a religious feast, a noble's birthday, a visit from the king, the table changed completely. Feast foods were designed to impress. They didn't just fill the stomach, they told stories of power, trade, and artistry. In noble households, cooks planned for days, sometimes weeks, preparing dishes with elaborate ingredients and complex methods. These meals could include multiple courses, with as many as 5, 6, or even more distinct rounds of dishes, each more luxurious than the last. Roasted meats were centerpieces, whole pigs, peacocks with their feathers reattached after cooking, swans posed on silver trays, and even gilded pies, meat pastries brushed with gold leaf, made dramatic entrances. Each dish was carved and served with ceremony, often accompanied by sauces made from exotic spices like cinnamon, ginger, or saffron. These spices were rarely tasted in everyday food. They were imported from the East and were staggeringly expensive. A pinch of black pepper cost as much as a labourer's daily wage. At feasts, they were used liberally to flavour meat, wine, and even sweets. The presence of these spices said as much about the host's connections and wealth as it did about their palate. Fish dishes at feasts were equally elaborate. Eels moulded into shapes, pike stuffed with herbs, salmon poached in almond milk and garnished with violets. These were presented with care, decorated with flowers, fruits, or pastries shaped like birds or crowns. Feast breads were different too. While commoners ate dark, heavy loaves made from barley or rye, nobles were served manchet, fine white wheat bread, light in texture and soft to the touch. These loaves were smaller, rounder, and often glazed with eggs or sweetened with honey. Desserts became events in themselves. Sugar sculptures, marzipan moulded into animals or towers, fruit tarts baked with elaborate lattice work, and custards flavoured with rosewater or nutmeg were all signs of refinement. On rare occasions, cooks even presented subtleties, edible art pieces made from sugar, pastry or jelly that resembled castles, dragons, or scenes from fables. Beverages, too, reflected the feast's grandeur. Instead of small beer or weak ale, guests drank wine, sometimes spiced and sweetened, sometimes served warm. Large jugs were passed down the table, and goblets clinked with laughter and songs. And then there were the entertainments. Feast halls echoed with music, laughter, storytelling, and the rhythmic steps of dancers. Jesters performed tricks, poets recited verses, and servants moved in practiced choreography, delivering dish after dish, like a slow, elegant dance. The meal could last for hours, stretching into the night, lit by candlelight and punctuated by the hum of contentment. For those who lived on the outside of these halls, the servants, the village cooks, the peasant families, such food was rarely tasted but often remembered. Leftovers from feasts were sometimes shared with staff or poor neighbours, and stories of the grand dishes filtered through the village like dreams told at dawn. Still, even those with little found their own ways to mark special occasions. A bit of honey in the bread, a roasted onion rather than a boiled one, a shared bottle of cider saved for Christmas. The difference was not always in the ingredients, but in the feeling. The sense that, for a moment, the world had paused its routine and something special had arrived. Everyday foods filled the belly, feast foods filled the imagination, and both, in their own way, reminded people of what it meant to gather, to share, and to taste the richness of life, whether in a clay bowl by the hearth or on silver plates beneath a vaulted ceiling. In a world without refrigeration, supermarkets, or imported produce flown in from distant lands, medieval people ate with the seasons. The changing months dictated what was planted, what was harvested, and what could be stored. Meals shifted with the weather, light and green in spring, hearty and starchy in winter, and the rhythm of seasonal eating was woven into the fabric of daily life. Spring was a time of renewal. After the long winter, when cellars were nearly bare and dried foods had lost their appeal, the first green shoots were a welcome sight. Peasants gathered wild greens like sorrel, dandelion, and nettles to stir into stews. Leeks and spring onions returned to the garden beds. Lambs born in early spring meant fresh milk, and with it, the chance to make soft cheeses and butter. Eggs were plentiful again as hens resumed laying, and the lightness of the season was reflected in simple, fresh meals. Herb porridges, soft cheeses with bread, and broth with young vegetables. Summer brought abundance. Fields burst with grains, barley, rye, oats, and in wealthier areas, wheat. Berries and fruits ripened in the hedgerows, strawberries, raspberries, gooseberries. Gardens yielded beans, broad peas, cucumbers, and cabbages. Herbs were harvested and hung to dry. This was a time for preservation. Smoking fish, salting pork, drying herbs, and making cheese to last into the colder months. It was a season of preparation, where even as food was enjoyed, eyes were already on the winter ahead. Autumn was the true season of harvest. Grains were gathered and taken to the mill to be ground into flour. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots, parsnips were pulled from the earth and packed in straw or kept in cool storage pits. Apples and pears were picked and stored, while others were dried or turned into cider. Pigs were slaughtered and hams salted or smoked. Cabbages were fermented into sauerkraut. Every home bustled with activity as families prepared to stretch their harvest through the coming cold. And then came winter, a time of conservation and creativity. With the land asleep and the gardens bare, meals were made from what had been stored. Dried beans and lentils were soaked and cooked slowly. Salted meat was trimmed and boiled to remove the brine. Flatbread was made from coarse flour and cooked over the hearth. Dried fruits added bursts of flavour to porridge or stews. Everything was used with care because it had to last. In noble homes, the shift of the seasons was softened by wealth, imported foods, stocked pantries, and better preservation meant the differences between seasons weren't as stark. Still, even they felt the pull of nature's calendar. Summer feasts featured fresh trout, salads of greens and herbs, and fruit tarts with wild berries. Winter meals leaned on meat pies, heavy stews, and sauces thickened with almonds and bread. Monasteries were deeply tied to the land and its seasons. Their gardens were planned carefully to provide both food and medicine. Monks charted planting schedules and maintained detailed records of yields, crop rotations, and weather patterns. Meals reflected this attention. Spring soups with leeks and herbs, summer platters of boiled beans and cheese, autumn bread with apples, and winter stews thick with legumes. For peasants, seasonal eating was a necessity, but also a form of celebration. Each season brought its joys: the first milk after winter, the smell of bread made from freshly milled grain, the taste of an apple pulled straight from the tree. Even hardship was softened by tradition, like the warming comfort of a root stew in January or the bright pop of sorrel in a May pottage. Festivals often mirrored the seasons. Harvest feasts in autumn gave thanks for abundance. Candlemas in early February brought warm, spiced bread. Easter celebrated rebirth with eggs and herbs. Midsummer featured honey, fresh fruits, and mead. These moments tied the rhythms of the year to the rhythms of the table. In this way, the medieval kitchen was never disconnected from the earth. It followed the curve of the year, adapting with grace and patience. Cooks didn't ask what they felt like eating. They asked what was growing, what was ready, what would spoil, and what needed to last. And so, in each bite, the seasons were tasted, not as luxuries or trends, but as natural, expected parts of life. From the first green bud to the last dried bean, the medieval table told the story of the year. As the final light of day faded behind hills and towers, the medieval kitchen began to quiet. Fires that had roared all day were now embers, glowing low and warm beneath soot-darkened pots. The work of feeding the household, whether a single family or a noble court, had come to an end, and now came the final ritual, the clean-up. The rhythm of the evening was slower, more deliberate than the urgency of morning preparations or midday feasts. There was no rush now, only the comforting repetition of chores done for the 100th time, each one a quiet farewell to the day's labour. In a peasant's cottage, the process was humble but essential. The pot that had simmered over the fire, filled with barley, leeks, or stew, was carefully lifted and scraped clean with a flat spoon or handful of straw. What remained was not thrown away, but saved. Tomorrow's breakfast often began with tonight's leftovers. The pot itself, blackened from flames and spattered with broth, was scrubbed with ash and sand, then rinsed with water carried from the nearby well. No soap, just abrasion and patience. Breadcrumbs were swept from the rough table into a cloth pouch or tossed to the chickens outside. Knives were wiped on worn cloth, checked for sharpness, and tucked away in wooden sheaths. Wooden bowls were rinsed in a shared basin, their surfaces dulled by use, but clean enough to serve again. Clay jugs were refilled and sealed with cloth or a wooden stopper. The floor, often of packed earth, was swept with a bundle of twigs. Embers from the hearth were banked under a mound of ash to preserve their heat for the morning fire. A small piece of meat fat or a candle stub might be left to melt slowly in a lamp, casting a soft glow that would last until the house settled into sleep. In larger kitchens, the ritual was far more extensive. Multiple fires had to be extinguished or carefully maintained. Coals were gathered into baskets, ash removed from stone hearths, and water heated to clean the day's cookware. Brass and iron pots were scrubbed, wiped dry, and hung on hooks along the wall. Pans used for roasting were scoured with bristles, and wooden spoons were inspected for cracks or splinters. Scullions, the lowest-ranking servants, often bore the brunt of the cleanup. On their knees with cloths and buckets, they cleaned the floors, scrubbed the tables, and hauled out slop buckets to compost piles or animal troughs. It was thankless work, but vital. The kitchen's order was measured not just by what it cooked, but how it was restored afterward. Bread ovens were checked and cleaned, their interiors still radiating heat. The baker might place dough to rise overnight in a cool corner, wrapped in damp cloth and guarded from mice. Spices were returned to locked boxes, their lids sealed and keys handed back to the steward. Cloths used for wiping, covering, and carrying were rinsed, wrung, and hung to dry near the chimney's remaining warmth. Leftover food was divided. Some went to servants, some to the poor at the gate, and some to the larder, carefully wrapped in leaves or sealed in clay jars. Cheese was recovered in waxed cloth, meats rubbed again with salt, and stews poured into ceramic crocks to keep until morning. And then the doors were shut. The sounds quieted. The fire crackled softer now, its flames dancing in slow amber waves. A final cup of ale might be shared among the remaining cooks. A last piece of bread dipped in broth. A sigh of relief. A stretch of tired arms. The kitchen, so loud and alive during the day, was now a place of stillness. In that silence, surrounded by clean tools and resting pots, there was a kind of peace. The knowledge that the household had been fed, that the work had been done, that tomorrow would come, with new tasks and new meals. But for now, there was rest. A candle flickered low. The last bowl was stacked, and in the gentle dark, the medieval kitchen finally slept. Now, as the hearth grows dim and the night presses softly against shuttered windows, we come to the end of our journey through medieval kitchens, a world of quiet labour, steady hands, and the timeless rhythm of preparing food from what the earth and season could offer. You've walked through smoky stone kitchens and warm wooden cottages. You've smelled fresh bread pulled from shared ovens and heard the low bubble of pottage simmering for hours. You've sat beside crackling fires and watched as meat turned slowly on the spit, while hands passed down knives worn smooth with use, and bowls held the same meals day after day. Because they had to. You've met the people whose names history didn't always keep. The servant ladling broth in the shadows of a noble hall. The mother stirring a pot before sunrise. The boy turning a spit in silence. Their tools were simple, their ingredients modest, but their work was constant, thoughtful, and full of care. From the first light of dawn, when a cook gently coaxes the fire back to life, to the last spoon scraped clean before sleep, every step has been a quiet act of survival and love. These meals were never just food. They were effort, memory, and comfort. They connected people to the land, to each other, and to something greater than themselves, a sense of place, of belonging, and of tradition. And though centuries have passed, and kitchens today hum with electric light and polished metal, something remains the same. The way we pause when something smells just right, the warmth that gathers in a room filled with steam. The calm that comes after the final dish is done. So now, take a long, slow breath. Let the day drift behind you. The last coals in the hearth are fading, and outside, the stars are high. The bowls are stacked. The fire is safe. The kitchen rests. And so may you.